So today we've got Associate Professor George Kiroff has given up his time to come and address us today. George has been a Fellow of the Royal Australian College of Surgeons for more than 30 years and is currently a staff surgeon at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide. Previous positions include head and upper gastrointestinal tract surgery at Geelong Hospital, Barwon Health, and Associate Professor at Deakin University. His clinical interests include surgery for gastroesophageal reflux, bariatric surgery, and surgical education. He has held multiple roles in the Royal Australian College of Surgeons, including course director of the Early Management of Severe Trauma program, membership of the Victorian State Committee, and the Project China team. His diverse research interests include surgery for reflux, the immune consequences of splenectomy, development of biomaterials, and translation of research findings into clinical practice. He's also played an important role in the provision of surgical services to rural Australian communities, including a period of a rural surgeon in Port Lincoln. He has more than 60 publications in peer-reviewed journals. So I asked George to come and talk to you. His subject is, why are we so fat and what can we do about it? Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Rob for the kind invitation. One of those things that I do was bariatric surgery, and your flyer was read to me by a guest at a lunch that I attended a couple of days ago, and she misread it as barbaric surgery. I can assure you I do know barbaric surgery, but you might like to think about it by the end of the presentation. Look, I should preface this with a little quote from our friend Einstein here, who almost 100 years ago said insanity is doing more of the same thing and expecting a different outcome. Well, we've been doing more of the same thing in the management of overweight and obesity for the last 50 years, and we continue to do the same thing. And why on earth would we expect a different outcome? This is what's been happening. I want you to focus particularly on the two middle lines. These are the percentage of overweight and the percentage of obese in Australia. Combined, overweight and obesity accounts for 50% of the adult population, or just over 50% of the adult population. I could extrapolate those curves backwards, and this ends in 2011, but I could since extrapolate them forwards. Nothing changes. Those graphs, those lines continue to inexorably increase, and the ideal body weight individuals in Australia continue to decrease. Why don't we get the message? And this is the dominant paradigm in our thinking about obesity. It's pretty simplistic, and it tends to attribute the blame to the individual. Now, there's no doubt that personal responsibility underlies everything we do, and it should continue to do so. But I can translate that for you. Energy consumed minus energy expenditure is equal to a change in weight. What our thinking really says is that gluttony and sloth contribute to weight. And that's really a very pejorative statement, and it's just not true. Okay, it's not true. Once you are morbidly obese, it is extremely difficult to lose weight. Extremely difficult to lose weight, and it's not about gluttony and sloth. It's all about the settings that are put in the womb, in infancy and in early childhood that contribute to the ongoing problem that we have with obesity. So what I'm going to tell you in the next 15 or 20 minutes is not actually going to benefit anyone in this room, but it may benefit your children and your grandchildren if we get this right. It's a little bit like addressing climate change, which we can debate that later. So it's not really this simple. That's my message. Some calories are actually worse than others, and I'll show you some evidence for this. Changes in consumption and expenditure in the last 50 years do explain this epidemic, global obesity epidemic, which medicos have termed globesity. And I believe that there is a significant role of capitalism and modern economics in all of this, and I think we can apply some of the lessons that we've learned from smoking to addressing this problem. So I'll tell you the three take-home messages now, and I'll reinforce them again at the end. I believe, and I'll show you some evidence for this, that obesity is a significant health problem, not just a cosmetic issue. I believe that it's largely linked to sugar consumption, which is a relatively modern phenomenon. 250 years ago, there simply wasn't a sugar industry. And I believe that we need to be more clever than simply taxing sugar, but we can achieve this. I think we need to be more clever than simply taxing sugar to achieve the outcomes that we desire. So, not all fat is equally bad, I have to say. It's odd. Bariatric surgery is surgery for obesity, by the way, and I do some of this, less now than I used to in my private practice a few years ago. But oddly enough, 80% of the patients that turned up looking for surgery for obesity were women, despite the fact that it tends to be men that get the metabolic syndrome. Women are motivated, they tend to be interested in their health and certainly interested in their appearance, and they're more likely to turn up to have surgery. Fortunately for women, they tend to carry their weight in their buttocks and their thighs. That's sort of a gynecoid distribution of fat, and where fat is located is really very important to the health consequences. It's the android distribution of fat, holding it in your guts, that is the major problem in terms of health consequences. So where fat is located is actually very significant in terms of the health implications. An apple shape is worse than a pear shape in terms of health consequences. Apples tend to be men, pears tend to be women. The waist to hip ratio is probably more important than pure body weight or BMI alone. BMI alone can be misleading. It is the ratio of how much you've got around your waist compared to how much you have in your hips. Apple-shaped obesity is associated with disease, especially type 2 diabetes. And look, this is Australian data for a 20-year period from the last decade of the last century to the first decade of the noughties, and we have witnessed a doubling in the incidence of type 2 diabetes in that time. That's really a major health problem for our community. It is going to impact adversely on the economics of health delivery. This needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in a preventive rather than a reactive fashion. We can't go on treating this. We need to stop it continuing. We need to stop it rising. Now, I promise you, this is the only piece of chemistry that I'm going to show you. But look, this is sucrose, common sugar, and sucrose consists of a dimer, two molecules linked in the middle, one glucose, one fructose, and when we consume this and it gets to the brush border of the small intestine, we've got an enzyme, disaccharidase, that splits this bond here, and we absorb independently glucose and fructose. Fructose can be used, and if you're an athlete and you're cycling 400 kilometres a week or something, or running marathons all the time, you'll use the fructose, it's no problem. But fructose is also linked to a pathway, a metabolic pathway that we have in the liver for conversion to triglyceride, and I'll show you a bit of evidence for that in a moment. Triglycerides are bad, okay? You only have to remember that. Triglycerides are bad. You don't want to have them. By the way, I notice a lot of people with a beer and with a glass of wine in front of them. Alcohol, 1 gram, 7 calories. 1 gram of alcohol, 7 calories. Okay, so too much alcohol is bad too, but an occasional drink is okay. Out of the United States, we've got reasonably good data about how much energy intake has increased. This is over a 40-year period from 1970 to 2010, and there's been a 20% increase in the calorie intake over a 40-year period. That's unsustainable. We can't go on eating 20% more every 40 years and think it's not going to have an impact, This is bad for us. Where do those calories come from? Well, this is where they've come from. It's largely in total sugar consumption. You'll see here total sugar consumption in pounds per year. And look at this, pounds per... It's inconceivable to me that adults could consume a total of 80 pounds of sugar a year. Inconceivable. It's almost 40 kilograms of sugar a year. Inconceivable. We don't have accurate data for Australia, but the United States has been keeping accurate data, and this is what it is. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that that's largely a consequence of the corn lobby. So high fructose corn syrup has increased dramatically in the United States as a substitute for sucrose, even though sucrose is incredibly cheap, $300 a tonne for a tonne of sugar. It's cheaper to produce high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup, more fructose, less glucose, more toxic. I'll show you why. As I said, the sugar industry has really developed in the last 250 years. You know, in the court of Louis XVI, there was an occasional sugar treat. By the time 100 years had gone by, we've had sugar foisted upon us largely as a consequence of the advent of the global trade in slavery. Sugar industry was developed in the New World because slaves were cheap labour, they were transported to the West Indies and to Central America, and consequently it became cheap to produce sugar. Sugar is now the most cultivated crop on earth. We grow more sugar than any other crop on earth. Indeed, 1.7 billion tonnes per annum. Now, not all of that's, consumed by humans. Indeed, the majority of it goes into stock feed and into fuel production. Nevertheless, that's a lot of resource going into the production of sugar. And it wasn't around 300 years ago. Our genetics cannot change that rapidly to adapt to this increase in sugar in our diet. It's not going to happen. 50,000 years from now, it might have happened, but it's not going to happen in the next couple of generations. Now, this gets a little bit complex, so I'll talk you through it. If you administer glucose to one group of patients and you administer fructose to another group of patients, they both, over a 10-week period, they'll both increase their total amount of fat. The increase is greater for the group that's had fructose than the group that's had glucose. But here's the rub. The group that's had fructose has largely an increase in the visceral adipose tissue, whereas the group that has glucose, it's largely subcutaneous adipose tissue. Visceral adipose tissue is that inside the belly, that android distribution of fat that I alluded to earlier on, that is bad for us, whereas if we carry it around in the buttocks and the hips, well, hey, it's not good, but it's not so bad for us. And the reason for this is that what we do is we've got a metabolic pathway in the liver that we share with all the apes and the bears. It's been around for about 40 or 50 million years in evolutionary terms. We have a metabolic pathway that enables us to convert fructose to triglyceride. Now, sitting next to Matteo here talking about, saturated fats and how important they are, and yes, to some extent they're important, but don't forget that if you're consuming fructose, after 10 weeks, what you're doing is even indeed after just 2 weeks, you're contributing to a significant, the asterisk marks statistical significance, you're contributing to a statistically significant rise in your triglyceride concentration. You make it yourself. It's not the fat that you eat, it is the sugar, particularly the fructose moiety of the sugar that you consume that makes this. All right, enough chemistry, no more chemistry. So what I'm going to focus on for the last 5 minutes or so is why I think that these are linked. This is, how we used to eat in the village. We'd make food, it would be fresh, it'd be largely vegetable-based, and we'd share it, it'd be available at the place we made it. This is now how we consume our drinks. It's largely a product that's manufactured in some plant somewhere, a huge amount of sugar in this product because it's a cheap source of calories. Paradoxically, it is in our community, it is the poor that are fattest. And you think, oh, they're poor. How can they be so overweight? Well, they're so overweight because they get their source of calories from these cheap manufactured foodstuffs, largely drinks, but they're cheap, they're readily available, and that's why it is the poorest that are most affected by this epidemic. However, the developing world is not immune. The developing world is adopting our taste in diet. I've visited India many times, I've operated there a number of times, and their own data suggests that by 2020, India will have 100 million people, more than 4 times the Australian population, that have type 2 diabetes because of the dietary changes that are occurring in India that enable poor people to now consume calories that are largely sugar-based. 100 million people. Can you imagine what that's going to do to the Indian budget? They're poor already. The current generation in China has 30% more obesity than the last generation. And these population changes are occurring so quickly that for all of my medical colleagues, research colleagues that say there is a genetic predisposition to obesity, and no one argues with that, there is a genetic predisposition to obesity, they must be linked to the dietary changes that are occurring. To deny that is to stick your head in the sand, you know. It's irrefutable. They're linked to the dietary changes that have occurred. We have more food than ever, but it's predominantly carbohydrate. Carbohydrate, I have to say, in case you don't know any chemistry, carbohydrate is basically a complex sugar. It's lots of sugar molecules linked up, okay? Protein is much more expensive than either fat or carbohydrate, and it is satiety generating. If you eat protein, you actually feel full. If you eat carbohydrate, you don't feel full. So consequently, you go back and have more. To change this trend, I believe, requires social change, and I'm going to suggest what that social change could be. Now look, this little meal deal, and would you like fries with that? You know, it's available extremely cheaply because it's an industrialised process. There are economies of scale. The manufacturers of this combo have the power of advertising and global reach. Whereas this is what we'd like people to be eating. Unfortunately, it's produced fresh, it's individualised, there's no advertising associated with it, and it's much more expensive as a consequence. So, we've attacked this by getting the manufacturers to tell us that they put a kilojoule count on it, okay? I was wandering through West Lakes through the West Lakes Westfield shopping centre a few weeks ago, and I went through the food court, and diligently on every item in the McDonald's stand there, they've got the kilojoules. What does that mean to you? Anyone in the audience, if I hadn't put that up, anyone in the audience know what that means? No, you're probably educated people. You knew. Okay, good on you. The vast majority of people in this room do not know what that means. Okay, it's meaningless to you, meaningless. So calorie advice on food doesn't actually convey the message. What I'd prefer is that there were little icons like that, a little man icon, and then it were filled up like that, because that's how much that calorie count represents in terms of your daily intake. Daily intake, that's the lunchtime meal deal. Don't tell me that's all you had, okay? That's not all you had. So we need to make this communication meaningful. We cannot rely on government to make it meaningful. They try to sell us things, will you buy? Government are useless at it. Believe me, they are useless at it. So that was 64% of daily calorie intake. We have had some success with smoking, and I'd like to think that this is a 30 or so year trend line in the decreasing prevalence of cigarette smoking in Australia. This has occurred because of taxation. Okay? Now, people have taxed cigarettes to death, and you can do that with cigarettes. For a start, there is some social stigma to smoking cigarettes. It affects other people, and cigarettes, tobacco is kind of non-essential, and you can actually impose tax on it that has a multiplying effect on the price of the product, and consequently a significant impact on the cost to the consumer. And maybe taxing the product will work with sugar. And certainly it's been advocated, and indeed it's been implemented. In the UK, they have implemented a tax on sugar in soft drinks. In Mexico, they've implemented a tax on sugar in soft drinks. It's proposed for New York. I don't know if it will get up and over the line. I'll tell you why I don't believe that that will work in Australia. Many of you probably aren't aware of this. Almost 70 cents is added to the price of one stick in a cigarette pack. One cigarette 70 cents of the cost of that one cigarette goes to the federal government in tobacco excise alone. GST adds another 10%, and then corporate profits are taxed. That's a large proportion. Indeed, it's difficult to know exactly how much, but about 80% of the cost of a packet of cigarettes goes to the government. It's difficult to know how much the government benefits from this, but as far as I can work out, in Australia, to the tune of about $6 billion a year of additional revenue goes to the federal government from tobacco. Consequently, they're a bit ambivalent about eliminating tobacco consumption altogether, because they rather like the revenue, and you get a bit sort of addicted to it, just like nicotine. Could similar punitive taxes be applied to sugar? Well, think about it. Tobacco is relatively expensive to produce anyway. A tonne of sugar, $300. 1 kilogram is 30 cents. 2 teaspoons is a fraction of a cent. How much tax would you have to apply to 2 teaspoons of sugar to modify behaviour? It's nonsense. In the UK, a litre of soft drink is going to have a total of 18 pence of tax applied to it. Is that really going to modify behaviour? No, it's not going to modify behaviour. What it will do, it will generate revenue. It will generate revenue for the state. It will not affect behaviour one jot. It will raise antibodies in the community against it, and probably the community will hardly modify their behaviour in terms of consumption. So, as I've said, certain jurisdictions have already introduced or plan to introduce a tax on sugar. I don't think it will work. I think that sugar use is so ubiquitous and so very cheap that we need to have more imaginative ways of addressing this. And in particular, if we try to do this, we're going to find it impacting most on the lower socioeconomic groups, who are the ones most prone to obesity and the ones least able to afford the tax. Direct taxation of this type, I think, will be regressive, and in any case, it's going to be fiercely resisted by industry. So what else can we do? Is there another way to influence sugar consumption? Well, I'd like you to think about this proposition for a moment. Instead of taxing sugar directly, amend the tax treatment of advertising and promotional expenditure of people who manufacture, let's start with drinks, people who manufacture drinks for consumption, drinks that contain sugar. So why on earth, when we know this is a poison, why on earth do we give people a tax break for promoting and pushing the poison on us? Why don't we turn that around and say, look, we're in a libertarian society, I have a liberal view in a democracy, people are entitled to make their own decisions, we won't ban sugar, we won't ban the products, we won't even ban your ability to advertise. We think that's all fair game. But damned if I'm going to give you a tax break for it. So to the extent where you produce a product that is sugar containing, to the proportion of revenue that you derive from those products, you do not get a tax break. To the proportion of revenue that you derive from other products that contain no sugar, you get a tax break. So by this simple strategy, you align the vision of industry to the needs of the community. You make their need to make a profit and compete, Cadbury Schweppes compete with Coca-Cola Amatil. The producer that goes more in the direction of sugar-free products and so gets a tax break has a competitive advantage. Why wouldn't industry buy this? They get a competitive advantage. Yes, we'll go down that route. I know that CCA only produce 40% of products that contain no sugar. For example, I've just made up that figure. Plausible, isn't it? Whereas Cadbury Schweppes produces 60% of products that contain no sugar. Therefore, Cadbury Schweppes is going to get a tax advantage over CCA. Why wouldn't CCA, in an effort to retain its business, go out and modify its product range, modify its marketing so that it really aggressively markets those products that contain no sugar in order to advantage itself compared to its competitors? They will. So by this really quite simple strategy, it aligns the interests of the manufacturers with those of the community. The proportion of deductibility of expenditure could be directly linked to the proportion of products low in sugar. It need not have any effect on the price of the end product. You don't want to advertise because you can't get a deduction? Fine, don't advertise. It achieves the same result. You expend nothing, you get no deduction. but you get no advertising, okay? So it achieves the same result because it's not promoted, which is where the rub is. It is really the promotion of these products to the young where the impact is greatest. Competitive pressures, I think, would ensure that all manufacturers develop and market appropriate products. So, in summary, I hope I've convinced you that not all calories are equal, and we should not take a pejorative view of people that are overweight, because this is something that has been cultivated over very, very many years, and usually the die is cast in infancy. Consumption of sugar has rocketed. It is closely linked to all of these problems in terms of health. The proportion of fructose has increased due to industrialisation. Fructose can be converted to triglyceride, that is particularly contributing to visceral adiposity in our abdomens. It is not fat that we consume on our pork chop. It is the fat that's made in our bodies from the consumption of sugar, particularly the fructose component of sugar. We're genetically primed to store this as visceral fat. Protein causes satiety, fructose does not. Exercise, I keep on getting asked, well, how much exercise do you have to do to stay trim and fit like I am? Exercise is important for general fitness, but you really can't exercise enough to lose a lot of weight, frankly. It's diet that's more important. It's what you consume that's more important. And economic drivers cause consumption of relatively more sugar in the hunt for protein, and this is where corporations have got it over us. I mean, they are working with a playing field that is tilted in their favour, in that they can promote products that are calorie rich but bad for us. We need to get clever with appropriate use of tax. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
We'll wait to get the mics up. We've got a couple. We'll start with Jeff.
Thank you for your presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Firstly, is the triglyceride that's produced, does that show up in cholesterol? And the second one is, I just wonder if you can comment on replacement of sugary drinks with aspartans and things of that nature.
You're suggesting, and I think the sugar industry would certainly suggest that synthetic additives, aspartame, are bad for you and toxic and all the rest. That is largely spin, and there's not a lot of evidence. Unfortunately, the more studies you do, the more likely you'll find a minor but statistical effect. Now, I'm saying to you that statistics, as Disraeli said, there's lies, damn lies, and there's statistics. Minor effects may be statistically significant but not clinically relevant. So I would dismiss that. But in any case, why does it need to be sweetened? Why can't, if they can promote, girls in skimpy bathing suits knocking back a can of Coke and have the community believe that if we did that 5 times a day, we'd all look like her, if they can promote that, they can surely promote something that doesn't have a sweet taste. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be sweetened, although the evidence for synthetic sweeteners being bad for you is very scant indeed. And although statistically significant, it may not be clinically significant. Sorry, I didn't get the first part of your question. Triglycerides. Triglycerides appear as a line item. Yes, when you do triglycerides and cholesterol, it's there, and it is the most toxic component of the fat. Yeah.
Peter.
George, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Just an anecdote, last week I ran 46 Ks.
Right.
I think I lost 100 grams in weight. So
yeah, well, there you go. There you go. It was probably water.
Quite possibly. My question is around industry lobbying and how you negate that. We've seen what's happened with smoking and with the mineral resource rent tax, how BHP and companies like that have actually lobbied to negate any community, I guess, best outcomes. And secondly, so first of all, how would you handle that? And secondly, how do you actually stop the lobbying? Because they're very powerful groups with lots of money. How do you actually negate that?
Okay. Look, they're both really good questions, and part of the reason for me speaking with you today is to engage your consciousness in this process. I mean, you can see that I haven't just thought of this overnight, you know. This is something that's been going around in my head for a few years, and I've actually written to our current health minister and our previous health minister. So at a federal level, I've written to people, and I get reassuring letters, written by their flunkies that tell me, we've got it all under control, Dr. Kiroff, don't you worry about that. Well, clearly they haven't got it under control. You know, that's rubbish. But I think that that's a reflection of pressure that they come under to, ignore the problem. I've even gone to the extent of engaging with the private health industry, private health insurance industry. I've written to them and I didn't even get a response. So please, if you know how to move mountains, I'd be glad to hear. So, be glad to hear.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. The question was the role of exercise. I know it doesn't actually help with losing weight, but its role in actually improving insulin sensitivity or reducing insulin resistance, number one. And the other question was basically a question on fasting and its role in weight reduction.
Well, I'm not a convert to the 5-2 diet, although a lot of my colleagues are, so I can't specifically answer that. And I want to get away from as I said at the outset, the thinking that we can, by diet intervention, affect our own individual health too greatly. I think for pretty well everyone in this room, there's a couple of youngsters, but we're probably most of us well past it. Exercise, hugely important for general fitness and reducing insulin resistance, hugely important. I'm not advocating for an instant that people do not exercise. You know, we've got to do that and advocate it for everyone. Very important in reducing the impact of type 2 diabetes, very important for overall cardiovascular fitness. But it will not make a lot of difference, as you just heard, 42 Ks and 100 grams. It doesn't make a lot of difference to weight. I cycle regularly and I don't drop a lot of weight doing that.
Any more questions?
No?
No more questions? All right, well, thank you, George. Very interesting. A little token of our thank you from the Rotary Club. That's traditional to get a pen, yes.
Okay,
It's a Medici pen, not a medical pen. All right, thank you, George.
Thanks, Rob.
All right.